Good evening. Today's lecture, in fact, I am going to devote on postmodernism and political theory, a theme which is very important from the point of view of political science as well as social science as a whole. In fact, this entire issue of postmodernism and its relationship with political theory, has to be understood from the point of view of the challenges which postmodernism has mounted, on the entire understanding, which has developed in last 400-500 years, particularly in modern time, and therefore, political theory as a branch of knowledge has also come under its spell. So, therefore, this issue that how this entire postmodernist intellectual movement has impacted political theory needs some discussion as well as it requires our attention. Now, in fact, one thing we should remember that this entire postmodernism, or one can say the postmodernist political theory or postmodernist theory, to put it in a different way, emerged as an intellectual movement in the later part of the 20th century, particularly 70s and 80s. Of course, it emerged as a challenge to modernity and its various attributes, and started questioning its many certitudes, because modernity, the entire modernist discourse is known for giving many certitudes, which will be basically taking into account in course of our discussion. So, therefore, it emerged as a challenge essentially to modernity and its attributes, its various features, various dimensions, particularly the way it has evolved over the over the centuries, particularly in last 4-5 centuries in Europe, and spread to different parts of the world. But as I mentioned, that since political theory as a branch of political philosophy, because earlier in fact this entire classification of knowledge in terms of different disciplinary boundaries is also a modern phenomenon, because earlier, as many of us would know, that we had philosophy, or at most political philosophy, which included many aspects today which we study under various branches of social science. So, this division of knowledge into various disciplinary boundaries, along with the division of various disciplines of social sciences along this line of factual and subjective or valuational discourses, or basically valuational studies. This entire thing happened in modern time, and this is how perhaps the modern knowledge system is organized and arranged. So, therefore, we can say that political theory as a branch of political philosophy is also a modern product, like many other products of modernity, and therefore, it shares many things with the modernity, particularly entire conception of power, its conception of power, and the notion of sovereignty, the way it basically locates sovereignty in a state and state institutions, and the kind of notion which is basically notion of history, which is associated with modernity, and to great extent one can say that political theory also shares it. Entire understanding of science, progress, freedom, emancipation, all these things one can say which are normally studied in political theory, normally from the standpoint of modernity and modernist discourse. So, therefore, when this postmodernism emerged as a challenge to this entire modernist project, then political theory also could not escape its onslaught, and therefore, it has come under its spell. So, in fact, it is in this context that we have to understand postmodernism and its relationship with political theory, because if you look at all these attributes which political theory shares with modernity, be it the notion of power or sovereignty, we find that this postmodernist project completely alters it and tries to provide altogether different framework to understand these issues and these phenomena. So, therefore, in fact, one can say that postmodernism has something very important, or one can say that very powerful idea to contribute on these issues, with which political theory works, and therefore one can say that political theory has been impacted by this postmodernist intellectual movement. Now, even the notion of history, the kind of linear progression of history which is associated with this modernist project, and political theory also to great extent shares that understanding of history, including the notion of truth, understanding of reality in totality, the entire understanding of totality, or one can say this holism in history. All these things are basically associated with this entire project of science and progress, and therefore one can say that these modernist attributes, or one can say that these aspects of modernist project have been interrogated, challenged and attacked by this postmodernist intellectual movement. Now, one thing we should remember, that what has happened, that is entire notion of freedom and emancipation, which are always very important for any political project, and political theory which seeks to understand the rules of various political and social reality, or one can say the social and political phenomena. Freedom and emancipation constitute important aspects of political theory and its project, and therefore when postmodernism tries to reimagine and reframe, when it tries to reimagine and reframe this entire issue of freedom and emancipation, one can say that political theory and postmodernism have come into some sort of engagement, particularly in terms of the criticisms and the critiques and the alternatives, one can say. Of course, we will look at these issues later, because this lecture will be divided into two parts. Some of the issues we will be discussing today, and the other remaining issues will be covered in the second part of the lecture. But one thing we should remember, that when we will come to criticism of postmodernism, we will see that how it is faltered or how it is criticized on this issue of providing alternative, because it is believed that it is very powerful in terms of negation, the negating the certain existing understanding of history, science, progress, even on number of issues. But nonetheless, one should remember that when it comes to providing an alternative, in fact postmodernism completely falters. So therefore, this is one important criticism, but nonetheless one cannot deny the fact that postmodernism, when it challenges modernism, also modernity, it also seeks to offer an alternative. Whether we consider those alternatives are not tenable, not sustainable, not feasible, that is altogether different matter. But from the point of view of postmodernity, one can say that there are certain alternatives, how they want to reorganize the society, how they understand to reframe the entire notion of emancipation and freedom. So we will be looking at all these issues in course of our two series lectures on this issue of political theory and postmodernism. Now, one thing we should remember, that modernity, the entire modernist project is basically contingent on certain foundational values, and they are known as foundational values of modernism, and those foundational values have come under direct conflict with this anti-foundational thrust of postmodernism, because we will be looking at this issue, this anti-foundationalism associated with postmodernism. What is this anti-foundationalism? Because anti-foundationalism, in other words, one can say that totally demolishes the foundational certitudes of modernity, foundational premises of modernity, on which basically the knowledge is basically on which knowledge is is created, on basis of which knowledge is developed. So therefore, foundational understanding comes into conflict with the anti-foundational thrust of postmodernism. Now, one thing we should remember, that so far as this postmodernism is concerned, it has spread to various areas, spheres of life, in literature, in social science, and so many other areas. But essentially we can see, but initially it started in architecture, particularly Western architecture. It was first used to describe experimental movement in Western architecture, and art and other things, and gradually it started picking up momentum in other spheres of social life. But one thing we should also remember, that so far as the origin of postmodernism is concerned in terms of its geographical location, in fact it emerged mostly in continental Europe, and that too in France, because within continental Europe it was France which became the epicenter of such churning, such ideas which are normally associated with postmodernism, and it started challenging the political theory which had become a norm in Anglo-American world. So therefore this entire postmodernist political theory, one can say, or one can say the postmodernism as a theory of social science challenged Anglo-American understanding of political and social reality which was dominant at that time. We will see later that how such challenges were mounted earlier also, particularly the school of history, which is also called historicism, the German school of historicism associated with Herder and others, who had questioned it. So therefore in fact earlier this questioning had happened in different form, and sometimes they are placed as antecedents of, or one can say the precursor of, or one can say that it presaged what is today known as postmodernism. But fact of the matter is that postmodernism does not recognize them as their its predecessors, because sometimes when it criticizes modernism, they also they put these schools, be it Romanticism or German school of historicism or or hermeneutics school alongside modernism and criticizes them. So therefore it would not be proper to say that postmodernism is basically the product of these movements in earlier period, in earlier epoch, particularly mid 18th century. But what I am trying to say here, that this challenge to Anglo-American worldview in political theory, in philosophy, was done earlier also, but postmodernism does it differently, with altogether different framework, with a different understanding of truth, with a different understanding of reality, with a different understanding of science, history, progress, so on and so forth. So therefore there are differences between the present version of this challenge to Anglo-American worldview, as I was just mentioning. Now one thing we should remember, that postmodernism as a school of thought is not very homogeneous. There are different scholars, different ideas, different shades within this broad postmodern worldview, as we normally call it. But nonetheless, and some of them interestingly do not identify themselves as postmodernists. For example, Derrida would not identify himself as a postmodernist, but nonetheless for our understanding we club together whole host of ideas which have emerged and which have been used, or which find place in this entire discourse which is associated with postmodernism. And a deconstruction associated with Derrida is one, the discourse theory associated with Michel Foucault is another, and similarly there are many such different hues of different hues, or one can say different brands of theorization which can come under the broad rubric called postmodernism. Now one thing we should remember, that postmodern and post-structural theories had great impact in 70s and particularly in 80s, with hardly any discussion in social science remaining untouched with this new development in knowledge system. And we can see the evidence of this this development in terms of the fact that it gradually got incorporated in the curriculum of most of the universities in the world, particularly while understanding the notion of power, the notion of identity, or one can say that the entire new social movements which emerged in the later part of 20th century and which started setting the tones, political tones in early 21st century. These new social movements were heavily inspired by this postmodernist theory, so far as the identity construction is concerned, so far as the multiple projects of emancipation is concerned, so far as the multi class, one can say, one should not use the class, because essential characteristic of these new social movements were their non-class character. So therefore one can say that these new social movements were heavily influenced by this new churning in name of postmodernism. And therefore when we find that movements, particularly the women's movement, ethnic movements, movements of for the gays' rights, the lesbian rights, and many other animal rights, environmental movements, which are normally called new social movements, when they started drawing their intellectual and philosophical inspirations, they fell heavily, they basically relied heavily on the resources which were generated by this postmodernist churning. And therefore we find that in politics it made a very powerful impact in 90s, and particularly in the beginning of 21st century. Now one can we can locate the basis for this churning, what is normally associated with postmodernism. In fact, it is basically seen that the shift from modernity to postmodernity and the cultural shift from modernism to postmodernism triggered this new movement from the modern understanding or modern worldview to the postmodern worldview, so far as the social science is concerned. So how this shift happened? First of all, before we move to this postmodernist worldview or its attributes and the features, the tenets of this postmodernist theory, we should also understand that what essentially we mean by a modernity and the modernist worldview or the modernist project, because essentially postmodernism was an assault on this modernist project. So therefore we should first of all have a look at the essential features of modernism. Now one thing we should remember, that modernism is associated with modern period in history, particularly after 16th century. Normally the developments which happened in Europe essentially is associated with 3-4 important historical developments, that is Reformation, Renaissance, birth of capitalism, scientific revolution, and subsequently industrialization or industrial revolution, all these things, and above all this entire enlightenment. So what happened, that all these events in history, one after another in quick succession, led to massive changes in social, political, cultural and economic spheres. And it was in this backdrop that we find that great theorizations happened. Great meta theories were built about understanding society, understanding about understanding human progress, understanding the entire issue of truth. So all these issues were emerging at that time. Of course, the catalyst was the scientific revolution, the great scientific revolution which happened in modern time, which completely transformed the understanding about the universe. And therefore the great scientific revolutions associated with Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo and many others, about the understanding of natural phenomena, about nature, about natural reality, all these things led to a sequence of changes, and accordingly we find that along with scientific revolution we had great theorizations in philosophy, in political theory, in modern times, starting with Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher, who gave altogether different notion of state power, who basically separated ethics and politics and religion and politics, and particularly one can say the secularization of society which started in modern time was basically heralded by these powerful philosophers through their theorizations and through their ideas. And later on we find that it has spread to other countries of Europe, particularly Britain, France and many other countries came under its influence. One thing we should also remember, that was also the period when entire Europe was undergoing a kind of a spatial and geographical transformation. On the ruins of religion, a new understanding of power and institutions was emerging. It was basically the birth and rise of modern nation states. Of course, the states existed even earlier, but nations are considered to be the modern phenomenon. And this entire formation of nationality and nationhood, along with this ideology of nationalism, emerged along with these developments which I have already mentioned: secularization of society, weakening of the hold of the church, and then strengthening of state institutions. This is how the concept of sovereignty emerged with Baudin, Hobbes, Austin, and many others in political theory. So this is how we can say that this modernist project found its expression in modern time. But one thing we should remember, that most of these features of modernism are understood in terms of certain foundational values which they bring to this entire understanding. Therefore, at times modernism is believed to be based on foundationalism. There are certain foundations on which one can say that this entire social, political, and economic reality are basically standing. So foundationalism is the cornerstone of modernism, whereas the postmodernism is understood in terms of its anti-foundational thrust. So therefore one can see that how postmodernism completely overturns the premises of modernism, and foundationalism versus anti-foundationalism are the best example of this. Now therefore this modernism and its foundationalism have to be seen with reference to certain features. That what are those features? And those features are important to understand that how they have been interrogated, questioned, and challenged by postmodernism. So this is how we have to proceed so far as the understanding of postmodernism is concerned. So therefore this foundationalism, which is normally associated with modernism, is attacked, or one can say challenged, by the postmodernism through its anti-foundational understanding or anti-foundational thrust in theory. Now what are these foundational premises of social and political reality so far as the modernist project is concerned? The first important thing is this industrialization and class solidarity. One thing we should remember, that modernity's entire modernist project is basically intimately tied with this project of industrialization or process of industrialization. The way industrialization led to transformation in social and political life initially in Europe and later different parts of the world, gave a clue to basically the process of progress in history, that every society has a similar future in store. And this is how at times particularly the romantic scholars, or one can say that many schools of thought before postmodernism also challenged this way of visualizing future of humanity and progress. And here we are reminded of the great utopian thinkers, be it socialists, or one can say that anarchist school of thought. So all of them were uncomfortable with this relationship which was made between industrialization and progress, and the way it was believed that the Europe was showing the path to the less developed world or underdeveloped world or underdeveloped societies in the world. So therefore in fact what happened, that here this industrialization as a certitude, one can say, was also intimately tied with the question of progress, but at the same time it was also tied with a particular worldview, that this is how the world has to move. And along with this industrialization, the question of class solidarity, because it was believed that industrialization leads to a particular way of producing goods. Industrialization leads to a definitive type of production process, and which ultimately result into a particular type of class formation, and that class formation gets translated into some sort of class solidarity. So, one after another, one was tied with the another. So, therefore, industrialism was at the was the root cause of such changes which were to follow so far as the social evolution and social progress were concerned. Now, along with industrialization, the social identity, it was believed in this project, that is modernist project, is often determined by one's position in production process. So, ultimately it is a production process which gives you your identity, the social identity, and therefore one can say that it is the economic process which builds human identity in society, particularly in modern time, due to the changes from the traditional to the modern period in history. So, therefore, this the second is a corollary of the first one, the industrialization and the class solidarity, was the construction of identity or identity building, and that was believed to be determined by one's position in production process. And this production process, we should remember, was essentially seen as a capitalist production process or capitalism, where in fact the particular way of production happens, and therefore this entire modernist project looked at these developments through the prism of capitalism, the way it developed in the Europe after the transition from feudalism to capitalism, propelled by the scientific revolution on the one hand, and Reformation, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and other similar intellectual movements. So, therefore, what we find that this production process and the relationship which was posited between production process and identity were the important issues so far as the foundational understanding of modernism was concerned. Now, then another issue which also was often highlighted was the primacy of reason and particularly its role in science, particularly the way reason transformed the modern man and woman in the world. Now, one thing we should remember, that this the entire Enlightenment as it is understood in European context was a product of this revolution, when reason superseded faith, reason when replaced faith and many other attributes of the medieval period, and human beings drunk with this modern science and reason thought that everything could be conquered, including nature. So, therefore, human beings with reason became the center of this universe and attention, and it is in this context that this modernist project, along with the scientific revolution, Enlightenment, Renaissance, and all these things which I have already mentioned, one after another in quick succession, led to certain a particular type of understanding about social and political reality, and those understanding, particularly such understanding, was called a foundational understanding about reality, that there is a correspondence between the reality, the truth, or one can say that there is a relationship between the truth and certain other features, foundational features of society. So, it is in this context we should also remember that modernist theory often try to build grand theory about humanity, grand theory about human society, and it is in this context that the entire issue of meta-narrative has to be understood, which later got punctured by this postmodernist discourse, because when the understanding of reality was totally seen through the prism of objective truth, when it was believed that there is a truth out there which can be understood with definitive perception, or one can say that one can understand the objective truth in its totality, then it was also believed along with this that a grand theory of history, a grand theory of society, and a grand theory of human progress could be built, and accordingly human beings could move further. So, therefore, the grand theorization and meta narratives were the two sides of the same process, which were closely associated with this particular type of truth, which was basically seen through the prism of objectivity. So, therefore, what we find that the way natural science looked at truth through experimentation, the way natural science looked at truth through the prism of objectivity, similarly the human sciences also started thinking and discussing the notion of truth, and therefore, the entire understanding of truth as absolute truth, and it was also similar argued that that absolute truth is within the reach of human mind, and human beings could understand that truth through science and reason. So, therefore, the science and reason became the vehicles on which human beings started travelling in direction of building this grand theory and constructing this meta narrative about human progress and human history. And it is not just a chance that in modern times we find that the grand theories of history, historical evolution, progress, emancipation were built, be it Karl Marx, or one can say Max Weber, or Durkheim, the sociologists, or number of other philosophers and theorists one can cite here, Hegel before Marx, and many others. So, therefore, what happened that this entire understanding of truth, tool of reason and science became allies in this massive in this journey towards building the grand theory of progress and grand theory of history. Now, it was also argued that there are certain patterns in evolution, there are certain underlying rules in social evolution and historical evolution, and those rules have to be understood the way we understand the rules of nature, and therefore, the way natural science uses those understandings, particularly about those rules of evolution, and makes human being the master of its destiny. Similarly, in fact, the social and political theories can also decipher those underlying rules of evolution and can make these things amenable to human reason, or one can say that human beings can control those processes with the help of reason and science. So, all these things were product of this entire process where not one but multiple factors came into being, and it is in this context that this grand theorization was the mission, and not only mission, but it was also seen as the integral part of this entire project, that is the modernist project. Now, as I have already mentioned, the notion of history and progress were the product of this entire thing, and grand theorization was done on the issue of history and progress, that what should be the nature of what should be the future of human beings, what would be the future history of human beings, and it is here that we can see that how this evolutionary trajectory about human evolution was also prophesied through a very hard theorization, be it Karl Marx when he gave a particular pattern in the evolution of history, or a number of other schools of thought which were not essentially speaking and writing or theorizing in Marxian parlance or Marxian fashion, but nonetheless that line of thinking was more or less similar. Along with this, I have already mentioned the notion of truth, that how truth was seen through the prism of objectivity, objective truth, and based on certain universal values. One thing we should remember, that this understanding of truth in this modernist project was essentially the correspondence theory of truth, that every reality has a corresponding every truth has to have a corresponding reality outside there. So, correspondence between the reality out there and our understanding was sought to be established. So, therefore, this understanding of total truth, that truth, objective truth out there, and we can perceive it in its totality, in its fullness, through our reason, through our mind, was another important dimension of this entire modernist project. And then the universal reality and the general theorization, which are to some extent similar to what I mentioned about the grand theory and the meta narrative, because it was believed that the realities have some minor differences, but nonetheless they have certain universal commonalities, and on basis of those universal commonalities one can have a general theory about all these issues. So, these were some of the features of the modernist project. I mentioned all these features and attributes because ultimately all of them have come under questioning and attack one by one so far as the postmodernism is concerned. Now, that brings me to this question of postmodernism, that how it tried to displace all these all these aspects of the modernist project, and and also tries to replace them with their own understanding, or one can say that replaces them, not only attacks but also provides their own framework about understanding history, understanding progress, and most importantly the understanding truth. Because on the one hand we saw that the modernist project, the entire understanding of reality or the truth was essentialist in nature, whereas the postmodernism turns into relativism, that there is no essential reality, there is no essence to any reality, and therefore there is no total truth, there is no objective truth. Whatever truth we know is relative, and therefore we should be contented with that. Now, that brings me to the question of this postmodernism. Now, this postmodernism, as I mentioned, that has spread in different areas of human sciences, social sciences, and as I mentioned, started with the architecture, started with the art and painting, and gradually spread to the various branches of social science. Now, one thing we should also remember, that when we talk of postmodernism, we find there are two different ways in which scholars look at this postmodernist project and postmodernist discourse. In fact, postmodernism has two different approaches, one can say. The first approach, one can say that in this first approach the scholars look at it as a concrete historical epoch. When they say postmodern, they essentially mean that something which has happened after modernism, or something which has followed the modern period in history, and therefore chronologically one can say that it is a postmodern. So, therefore, for them it is not a theoretical framework, it is not a philosophical way of looking at things only, but it is a concrete historical epoch. Things have literally changed, and therefore this postmodern period should be seen as in terms of the essential essential attributes of the time and period in which we are living. So, what is this nature of concrete historical epoch? And here some of the scholars who can be put here in this category, who look at it as a concrete historical epoch, is David Harvey, Lyotard, and Jameson. These three scholars look at postmodernism. When they talk of postmodernism, they theorize postmodernism, they essentially look at it as a concrete historical epoch. Now, for them postmodern is a stage of history, the way modern was also a stage of history. So, post this prefix post symbolizes this transition from modern to a new stage in history. Now, of course, what happens, that what they do, that in this, because of this transformation, the changes which have happened in society, in economy, in culture, in number of social processes, what they feel that we have to change our scale of understanding. We have to develop a different lens and different grid through which we have to look at the changes, and therefore they offer a new framework to understand the new changes, which according to them is a new stage in our history. Now, of course, what they do, that they challenge both Enlightenment modernism and Marxism. Of course, there are many scholars who would say that Marxism is also a modernist project and product of Enlightenment, but we should also remember that Marx was one philosopher who was of course a product of modernity and Enlightenment, but nonetheless he could also see the limitations associated with this project and therefore started critiquing it. So, on the one hand he had a vision of a linear progression of history, but at the same time he was also very critical of the supremacy of reason and science, particularly in terms of its negative fallouts on human existence and nature, and therefore, it is not just a chance that he authored a book, Economic and Philosophic Manuscript. Of course, there is a lot of debate there between young and the old Marx, because it was a writing of a young Marx, and many people believe that he was under the influence of Hegel. It was a Hegelian Marx, and therefore, the kind of understanding he developed at that time was not of that scientific nature which is associated with his later and more accomplished work, that is Capital. But nonetheless, one thing we should remember, that so far this school of thought within postmodernism is concerned, which looks at postmodern period in history as one of the stages, like modern was one stage earlier. Now, for them, both Enlightenment modernism and Marxism have to be critiqued and interrogated, and therefore they challenge both in the same breath. Now, Harvey, one of the leading voice of this approach, in fact he calls conditions of modernity, that what are the new conditions of modernity, and therefore those conditions necessitate a reframing of the entire issue, and therefore the changes in those conditions have to be understood properly if we have to understand our future journey more effectively. Now, therefore, for this school, the changes which have taken place are significant and qualitative, and those changes cannot be brushed aside, because for them the first important change is that there is a change in the forces of production, in fact the way production is happening in society, and because of the nature of changes in production process, the entire class position of people is changing. Because what has happened, that identity formation today is taking place through consumption instead of production, and as earlier during the modernist epoch, it was the production process and one's location within that process which was providing identity to the people in society, because as mentioned earlier, that human identity was seen through the prism of economic process, particularly the production process, and everyone had to be seen as through their location in this in this production process. But not, what they argue, that what has happened in these postmodern conditions, that forces of productions have undergone changes, class position has changed. Now, identity formation or construction is taking place through consumption in a post-Fordist development in United States of America and other places. The developments which have happened in industrial sector are called post-Fordist, because the Fordist development, Taylorism and Fordism were the essential features of industrial industrialization and the modernist project. But here it is argued that in the post-Fordist development, it is the consumption which is basically becoming more important and playing central role in the construction of identity. So, therefore, this transition from production to consumption is an important aspect so far as this new stage in history is concerned for these thinkers and these scholars of postmodernism. Then, of course, they also talk of the service sector. Particularly the way service sector is playing in fact important role in today's life, and they argue that there is no relation to means of production so far as the human identity or human existence is concerned. Of course, production takes place, but so far as the primacy is concerned, it is ultimately the service sector which is playing more important role. And because of this new development, there is a lot of flexibility in accumulation of capital. There is no fixed workforce. In fact, what has happened, that there has been a contractualization of labor, or in other words one can say informalization of labor. Instead of a production unit, identifiable production unit, now what has happened, that the entire production has been informalized, and that has resulted into this contractualization of labor. Now, along with this, there is a related development, that is basically the birth of a symbolic capital, which is also at times referred to as a speculative capital. Particularly this speculative capital happening through with the help of technology, and through markets. And for example, the symbolic capital is explained with reference to art object which acquires value, and therefore these values are symbolic in nature and nothing so intrinsic as it was perhaps the case earlier. So therefore the symbolic capital, speculative capital happening through the new information technology and revolution in information technology, all these things have also led to the changes and transformation in the nature of production and the nature of class location so far people are concerned. Now along with these changes, this school of thought like Harvey and others would also take into account the second order changes in society which are equally important. And in second order changes they consider information technology, as I mentioned, is playing very important role in this speculative capital or symbolic capital. Then eclecticism of taste, new dimension of a space, the local global relationship, the slogan that think globally, act locally, the actions have to be locally organized, the entire notion of voluntarism, the civil society associations, the kind of emphasis they attach to civil society associations, all these changes they call the second order changes, which are basically product of the larger changes triggered by the changes in production process, which I mentioned, that from production to consumption in fact is behind all these important transformations in this postmodern epoch, which they call postmodern conditions. Now of course if we see the second approach or second way through which some of the scholars look at this postmodernism, then it is to be presented as a theoretical framework. First one, as I put it, is a concrete historical epoch, but for the second school it is a theoretical framework. This is not seen with reference to the concrete historical changes, and therefore do not look at it simply as one of the stages in history. And here in fact one can cite the names of Derrida, Richard Rorty, Gilles Deleuze, Laclau, Moffat, and many others, and some of them of course may not like to be associated or may not be branded as a postmodernist. As I mentioned, Derrida may not perhaps accept this characterization as a postmodernist thinker, but nonetheless his entire deconstruction theory plays very important role in this entire postmodernist intellectual movement. So is the case with Michel Foucault. His entire discourse theory, in fact he perhaps was he was not aware that his entire ideas were being framed in this entire manner in which the postmodernist project would be understood later. But nonetheless in fact his discourse theory is as important as perhaps Derrida's deconstruction theory. But here one thing which unites all of them, be it Derrida, Rorty, Deleuze, Laclau, Moffat, is that they look at it as a theoretical framework and not as a concrete historical epoch. And here in fact some of the important features of this postmodernism come into play, and here we have to see that what are those features. For example, anti-foundationalism, there is no single identity, there is no social movement, one social movement, and then multiple projects of emancipation, solidarity as open-ended, and so on and so forth. For example, the entire argument against totality, the signifier-signified relationship, not one to one, that is against this entire notion of correspondence theory of truth, entire attack on meta-narrative. All these things are basically the product of such thinking which can be associated with this school of thought which looks at postmodernism as a theoretical framework. In next part of our lecture we will be discussing all these issues, all these important attributes and features of postmodernism, particularly the way this theoretical, those scholars who look at it as a theoretical framework. And we will also have some idea, we will also try to discuss little bit the contributions and specific contributions of some of these thinkers.